Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I have your attention, please? All quiet, please. Thank you. Yeah, you guys are all quiet. That's for sure. Okay, so here we are. Ninth grade world history. I'm going to be giving you the remaining notes for the unit that we've been doing in class on independence movements in the Americas. So you should have your notes out. You're going to be taking notes on this. And you should have your handout out as well. Page 3, Latin American Wars of Independence. And yeah, keep all these notes together as we go through here. Okay, and this should pretty much wrap it up. Keep an eye on Google Classroom for information as far as like how we're going to do the test and all that kind of stuff. Okay, but suffice it to say, this is what we're going to be doing today. We'll wrap this up. So where were we at? We were at the beginning of Latin American Wars of Independence, which in history takes place because of certain things that took place before that, right? Going back to the beginning of this unit, we had the United States declaring independence because we got all upset at the British. They wanted us to help pay taxes for the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And a little problem. They didn't let us participate in their parliament. So we got all upset and we declared independence and we fought it and we won, thanks in part to the French, right? So now that we have the American Revolution, we saw, and we went through already, how the French Revolution in part came from that. The French had a lot of debt and they were trying to make certain changes in their government and they were going to include the nobles, and then everything just went whack. It was crazy. And the French Revolution ultimately led to all kinds of disruptions in Europe. In particular, Napoleon conquered Spain. And so Spain was out of the game. Well, and that's where things led to as far as the Latin American Wars of Independence. When Spain didn't have its king, Fernando, you had the Creoles taking charge with the Mask of Ferdinand in the Latin American provinces that you see right here. And then when he came back on the throne after Napoleon had been removed, he couldn't stay on the throne because the Spanish wanted to do all kinds of various different things, not having him as the absolute monarch. Right. So needless to say, independence movements took off in Latin America, and Spain tried its best, but really couldn't put it together to stop those independence movements, okay? We did start off with the Haitian one, and hopefully you guys, some of you guys were able to access that video. Really cool, on the Haitian independence. Of course, that was France's colony in the Caribbean, and they lost control of that to a successful slave uprising led by Toussaint Louverture. And so we've got, what, 2 successful independence revolutions in the Americas, and now come the others, right? So we go from Latin American provinces, you got New Spain and New Granada and so forth, and then you have these massive changes as far as independence for all of the Spanish territories, except Cuba and Puerto Rico. And then you have, then later we'll get to what takes place in Brazil, okay? Now, last time we went through and talked a little bit about what took place in Mexico, okay? You had the original revolutionary movement led by Father Hidalgo, which the poor people really loved him. The wealthier people, the Creoles, weren't too particularly fond of him because they were afraid, oh my gosh, this guy's going to come in and all the poor people are going to take control. And they're going to take control of the land, and we're not so sure about that. Well, they didn't have to worry about Father Miguel Hidalgo because he was captured in 1811 and killed. So, do you recall what happened then? This is a little bit of recap. Augustin de Iturbide, one of the Creoles, who has a military uniform and a horse, so that makes him a Cadillo. And he says to all of Father Miguel Hidalgo's supporters, about 90,000 of them all, hey, join us. I will be your great leader, and we will lead Mexico to independence. And so Spain ultimately did become independent. Who was the leader of that independence movement? This guy. Was he going to institute land reform and redistribute all the land to the poor people? No. So the mestizos and the natives living in Mexico didn't really get what they wanted. But Mexico became independent, and who was the first leader of Mexico as it became independent in 1821? This guy. He became the emperor. He lasted until 1823. No real changes as far as social changes for the poor, but who ultimately overthrew him? Do you recall that? Leading an effort for a republic with a president, authoritarian leader, Cadillo, instead of a emperor, you have Santa Anna, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Okay, and we're going to keep an eye on him. He's going to pop up in the next unit because he's very instrumental in the situation dealing with the independence movement of Texas, and then Texas ultimately joining the United States. And yeah, more drama there coming up. Okay, just as a recap, reminder that Mexico was much bigger initially, but the Central American areas of Mexico, they created the United Provinces of Central America, and this is in your notes. So they peeled off from Mexico, and then they broke up into their respective countries: Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, Costa Rica, and El Salvador. Okay, so that's the situation in Central America. You've got Mexico and the Central American countries, and who are the key people that are in charge in these regions? Caudillos. They're not really interested in representative democracy. Of course, they never really had representative democracy when the Spanish were in charge, not like the English colonies where you had all those colonial legislatures. And when those guys became independent as the United States of America, they continued on having representative democracy. Okay, so that's the situation for Central America. Let's turn our attention now to the region known as New Granada. That was the Spanish territory in the northern part of South America. Okay, so you've got kind of, let's see, sort of that area right up there in the north. Okay, an independence movement started in 1810, led by Simon Bolivar. All right, so we're going to be talking about a lot about Simon Bolivar in this particular part. It started in Caracas, which is now part of Venezuela. Simon Bolivar was a wealthy Creole, and he got the movement started in 1810. Now, let me see. Do you recall 1810? Who was there? A Spanish king? Oh yeah, he wasn't quite back on the throne yet. Mixed results. Some Spanish forces were able to keep that down, but ultimately by 1817, Simon Bolivar's independence movement really got going. Okay, and there were fights in various key areas between 1817 and 1822. Including, and you want to make note of this, there are two key battles as part of this effort in New Granada. The Battle of Boyacá, which was in 1819, that's in your handout, and that is in the area of modern Colombia. And Bolivar's forces defeated the Spanish royalist forces. In 1821, at the Battle of Carabobo, which is located in modern Venezuela, same result. Simon Bolivar was able to defeat the Spanish royalist forces. So you can see a trend going on here. Oh, and by the way, were Bolivar's independence forces, were they receiving any outside support? Well, there were two in particular. Well, obviously the United States, even though we're quite small and weakish and so forth, we're like, yeah, we support that. Haiti actually did give some support on the condition of abolishing a certain institution that was in existence in some parts of that northern area of South America. What institution would that be? Yeah, slavery. So slavery is going to come to an end in the newly independent areas. And guess which other European power was really, really interested in Spain and not controlling these areas, and so gave some support to Bolivar and his forces? Yeah, you called it Britain. What could Britain provide? Naval support. So the Spanish, in the midst of all this craziness, were not able to effectively fight the independence movement, and Bolivar was successful. And he created a new country. You can write this one down, obviously. The country is called Gran Colombia. It was established September 7th, 1821. And if you've never heard of Gran Colombia, that's because it doesn't exist anymore. You can see by the map that it was a large territory, pretty much all of New Granada, and it encompasses what is today Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, and Panama, which peels off of Colombia later on in the end of the 1800s. So, what is going to be the government of this new Gran Colombia, this new independent country? Well, they're going to set it up as a republic, so no emperor. And in a republic, let's see, there's going to be a president. Guess who's going to be the president of the new Gran Colombia? Well, just as the folks in the United States were like, hey, Washington, you want to be our president? The folks in Gran Colombia were like, hey, Bolivar, you're our great military leader. Why don't you be our president too? And so he did. He's set up as the president. And they set it up with a strong central government. So the central government is going to be telling everybody what to do in different parts of Gran Colombia. I wonder how that's going to go over. Well, we'll see. Bolivar is the president. Guess how they set that up? He's the lifetime president. Yeah. Same kind of situation that some people wanted George Washington to do, but Washington was like, no. But Bolivar's like, yeah, I'm a great military leader. I'll be your great president. Okay. Now, there are folks within Gran Colombia, call them federalists. They want more federal power in local regions. In other words, they don't like this big bossy central government telling them what to do. And so they're creating some resistance. They're like, hey, Bolivar, it was nice that you kicked the Spanish out, but we're not so happy with you and your big, massive central government bossing everyone around. So he gets some resistance. There's going to be uprisings and dissent taking place, to the point that Bolivar says, yeah, you know that president job I'm having? I think I'm actually going to change that to an official dictatorial position. 1828, Bolivar declares himself dictator. Is that going to solve it? He's taking complete, absolute, total control of the country, trying to put down uprisings over the next 2 years. Will it work? Will Bolivar go out as the hero? And yeah, no, he doesn't. At age 47 in 1830, he resigns as president. He resigns as dictator. It's like, he basically says, here's his quote, America is ungovernable. Well, maybe he means Gran Colombia. And as far as like ungovernable and not really like wanting to do everything he says and wanting to maybe do their own sort of thing, yeah, that may be the case. As it turns out, he dies that same year, 1830, of tuberculosis by the end of the year. So there you go. Simon Bolivar. He can get independence for these folks, but as far as governing them, yeah, they're not necessarily sure that they wanted a big, powerful national government controlling all these areas. So what happens? 1831, Gran Colombia dissolves into 3 separate countries. And the 3 countries are Colombia, which is the main one right here in the middle. That also includes the Panama little isthmus thing that is coming off of there. And then you also have Ecuador on the southern part, and then Venezuela over there on the eastern part, okay? And that is the fate of Gran Colombia, and Simon Bolivar in northern South America. Okay? We're going to turn our attention now to New Castile and La Plata. All right, so think of this as being the rest of South America, except for Brazil. All right, we'll deal with Brazil later. Portugal's got Brazil, and that's a whole separate story. So in your notes now, you can look on page 3. We got New Castile and La Plata, which is going to have its own independence movement going on at about the same time as all these other independence movements. Lucky Spain, you got to fight on many, many different fronts, and you will be a failure at all of those fronts. So the key leaders that we're going to be looking at here in the independence movements for the rest of South America are 2, and they're from the Creole class. They got land, they got money, and they got a horse and a military uniform, so they're also going to be kind of along the Caudillo pattern. So here we go. Here's one of them. We'll tell you first about Jose de San Martin. You see him up there? He is going to be the one who's going to be predominant in what we now know as Argentina. Okay. The other one is this fellow here, Bernardo O'Higgins. He's going to be located predominantly in Chile. Okay, so on the along the coast of South America. Bernardo O'Higgins, an interesting mix of heritage there. Anyone figure out like what's his heritage might come from? How about the Bernardo? Spain. What about the O'Higgins? Is that a Spanish surname? If you guessed Irish, you would be correct. He had heritage from both countries. So anyway, these guys are going to be taking the primary leadership in fighting the Spanish and going for independence in that area. Okay? So, the country established in 1816 is going to be the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata. Okay? That was what the independence movement was proclaimed in 1816. Mostly it consists of Argentina and the neighboring provinces. Now, if you're wondering, so you got that big kind of blue area right there on the map. And that's a lot of countries in South America today. So that united part, yeah, it's not going to remain very united for very long. Just like the United Provinces of Central America, they didn't remain united very long. The United States of America, oh, are they going to remain united? Well, spoilers, they will. Although we have a whole unit dedicated to them, the 3rd unit of this semester, the Civil War, but we'll hold off on that. Actually, it's very interesting because our task of keeping the United States together looks like a much greater accomplishment considering the kind of effort to keep other areas united in their early independence. Like Gran Colombia broke apart into 3 different countries. The Mexican area broke into 2 different parts, and then the United Provinces of Central America broke into multiple parts there. Well, that's what's going to happen here as well. So you've got this united movement, and you've got an effort to fight off the Spanish. All right, so let's see how that works. Key battles. I got 3 battles you're going to need to keep track of here in the fighting going on here, and they're all listed in your notes. Okay, so let's talk about them. 1817, the Battle of Chabuco. You see that in your notes? 1817, the Battle of Chabuco. That's going to be located in Chile, okay, along the Pacific coast. San Martin is going to be bringing his forces, Jose de San Martin is going to bring his forces and join the forces of O'Higgins. So we've got both of these independence leaders, and they're going to defeat the Spanish royalists. So that's a victory for the independence movement. Thank you very much. The Battle of Chabuco in 1817. Followed by another battle in 1818, the Battle of Maipú, which is also in the Chilean region along the Pacific coast. In that, again, you have San Martin and O'Higgins teaming up against the Spanish royalists, And they are pretty well defeated now in the Chilean region. And so 1818, you know what Chile does? They declare themselves independent as a separate independent country, not part of this United Provinces of Rio de la Plata. In other words, O'Higgins was like, yeah, we beat the Spanish over in this part of South America. And so we're just going to go ahead and, yeah, call it done. Thanks for the help, San Martin. Enjoy the trip back across the Andes so you can continue fighting against the Spanish in that part of South America. And O'Higgins will rule until 1823. He's the leader, the caudillo of Chile until 1823. Why doesn't he rule beyond 1823? Does he die of something? No, he's overthrown. Wow, he's overthrown. So, wow, we've got independence leaders. Bolivar, tossed out. O'Higgins, tossed out. Not too good. Let's see how things are going to work out now for San Martin's forces as he heads back over across the Andes into what is now predominantly Argentina. He's got a big battle, going to have multiple battles and so forth. The big battle that kind of wraps it all up there is the Battle of Ayacucho in 1824. Ayacucho is actually located in the Peruvian region. So you've got sort of that northern area of the Rio de la Plata. And they're going to defeat the forces of Spain. Oh, but they get some help. This is always very interesting. This is the last big battle in the Spanish Wars of Independence, and San Martin's forces get some help. From who? Will it be O'Higgins? No, actually it's Bolivar. Bolivar comes down, helps out, and wraps up, and the Spanish are no longer a force in South America. Okay? So there we go. What's going to happen with San Martin? He gets to be kind of in charge of that whole region there, that United Provinces of Rio de la Plata, minus Chile. But yeah, doesn't even seem to take very long before 1825, what is known as Upper Peru declares itself independent from Lower Peru. What? So you got Upper Peru declaring itself independent from Lower Peru. Now, if you're thinking upper, that is actually south because it's higher up in elevation than Peru, which would be located, let's see if I can get my finger, right about here. There's Upper Peru, excuse me, Lower Peru, lower as in closer to the coast. Upper Peru declares itself independence, and they were like, oh, what should we call ourselves? We need a really cool name, because Upper Peru sounds kind of lame. I mean, Peru is going to continue on as Peru and so forth, and they'll establish themselves as a country. But they decide to name their country after a famous independence leader from Latin America. Have you figured it out yet? Yes, they will become Bolivia, named after Simon Bolivar. Okay, so question. You've got Bolivia and Peru and Chile. I mean, are they going to be able to hold any of this all together? Could San Martin keep it all together? No. The fighting continues on now amongst the independence movement, the winners, and San Martin's like, yeah, you know what? I'm kind of done with this whole thing. I saw how it didn't work out for Bolivar and for O'Higgins to try and rule the countries that they had helped gain independence. So he packs it up. 1824. He's not really thrilled. It's a bad year for him. His wife died. And he just doesn't want to put up with all the nonsense of trying to rule a bunch of territories that really don't want to be all together. So he packs it up, gets on a boat, and moves to Europe, to France, where he spends the remaining days of his life. There you go. The independence movements of Latin America. And it's going to get quite interesting as we continue on in our next unit, what happens in these independent Latin American countries. Yeah. Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, Bolivia. There's only one we haven't really talked about yet. Are you ready for it? The Portuguese territory in South America. Brazil, where they speak not Spanish, but Portuguese. So how are things going to play out in Portugal's territory of Brazil? Well, this is an interesting one because the Portuguese monarchy has been looking at all this craziness going on of Spain trying to gain and maintain control of its territories. And they thought, well, if you can't beat them, independence movement people, maybe you should join them. And if you join them, maybe you can take over control of the independence movement. Very sneaky. Because if you can gain control of the independence movement, then when your country becomes independent, has things really changed? Well, that's how the Brazilian independence movement took place. A prince, his name is Dom Pedro. He's a Portuguese prince. His father, excuse me, is the king of Portugal. And they decide that when the Portuguese monarchy had been hanging out in Brazil after Napoleon was wrapped up in controlling large parts of Europe, the Portuguese monarchy got the heck out of there, hung out in Brazil for a long, long time. And then when Daddy, the king, headed back to Portugal, he designated his son, Dom Pedro, to be kind of like, yeah, why don't you lead the independence movement? And so there will be an independence movement in Brazil. And it's kind of weird. It's one of those things that's like, it's a fake independence movement because there's going to be fighting, although not a lot. What's going to happen after a very brief fight led by Dom Pedro against his dad, this Portuguese will quit Brazil and Brazil will become independent. 1822, Brazil is independent. Guess what kind of government they're going to set up? A constitutional monarchy. Guess who's going to be in charge of the Brazilian monarchy? Dom Pedro. Are they going to really change anything? No. The people who were wealthy and in charge of the land and in charge of running the show in Brazil are still going to be in charge of Brazil. As we look into our next unit, we're going to be looking at Brazil. We're going to say, has anything really changed there much? Not so much. One institution that's very, very big in the Brazilian economy, doing gold mining and doing sugar plantation harvesting and so forth, slavery. You're not going to see slavery reformed and gotten rid of until 1888. It's the last area in the world, certainly in Central and South America, to get rid of slavery. So there you go, Brazil. Okay. Meanwhile, let's look. The very last part of this unit is right there on page 3. The United States position toward Latin American independence. This is one of the things that IB has included in this IB paper 3 topic of independence movements in the Americas. And it picks up on this question of what is the United States doing relative to this whole Latin American independence movement thing going on? Well, we've already talked about this. Is the United States supportive of Latin American independence? Yeah, sure. Why not? Why should Spain and Portugal continue to control huge areas of the American continents when the United States had gained its independence from Britain? So an interesting thing takes place. Obviously, Spain, Portugal to a degree, really can't control their territories in the Americas. So these areas became independent. Well, what about other European countries? Could they come over and gain control of newly independent American countries? The possibility existed, and actually we'll see. For a while, France had established in the mid-1800s, they'd established some kind of like a puppet monarchy in Mexico. And the Mexicans are going to be, they're going to put pretty quick work, finish that wrapped up. In fact, I'm trying to think, when was it? It was a big day in Mexican history. May the 5th, when the French imperial puppet person Maximilian is lined up against a wall by the Mexican people and shot. Cinco de Mayo is what the Mexicans celebrate for that. More on that in the next unit. But let's get to this, the Monroe Doctrine. This was written during the time of President James Monroe. If you were looking up at my board, I would go, oh, look, he's the 5th president there after Washington, Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and now James Monroe. He comes in, and in the year 1823, he will issue, December 2nd, 1823, to be specific, he will issue what is going to be known in history as the Monroe Doctrine. Now, in truth, his Secretary of State, his top foreign policy guy, John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, and later to become the 6th president, checking up here on the wall, the 6th president of the United States, John Quincy Adams. Very, very important man. He was the guy who actually came up with the Monroe Doctrine, and of course the president's like, yeah, this looks good, let's make it happen. So what was the Monroe Doctrine? It basically said this: the United States is telling Europe, don't interfere with the newly independent states of North America or South America. If you do, that will be viewed by the United States as an act of aggression, and the United States will intervene. That's what we said. Although, were we really able to back up that very bold statement with a very powerful military, army, navy, and so forth? Not in 1823. No. Okay? No. In fact, the interesting thing is, and some of you guys have already figured this out, because there was a country that was very interested in Latin American independent countries remaining independent, so that this European country could continue trading with independent countries and wasn't kept away from those areas of the Americas by some colonial master, as they had been when the Spanish and Portuguese were in charge. Which country are we talking about? They got a big enough navy. They can actually carry out the Monroe Doctrine. It's Britain. Britain has its own doctrine, I don't know what it's called, but Britain's own doctrine was basically, yeah, these countries are free, let's let them remain free. And we saw that Britain soon became the #1 trading partner from Europe with all of these Latin American countries. Got that? So, yeah, thank you, Britain, for allowing the U.S. Monroe Doctrine, where we basically threaten the European powers to keep on their side of the Atlantic. But later, when the United States gets big and powerful and so forth, by the end of the 1800s, when we are the #1 industrial power of the world, and we got a big navy, decent sized army too, are we gonna like get involved in the affairs of Central America and South America and so forth? Yeah. In the 20th century, like when the Soviets have like nuclear missiles in Cuba and so forth, are we gonna get involved there? Yeah. So it's very, very interesting history coming up, the United States relationship with all these independent countries, okay? Even though we weren't very powerful, Latin American countries appreciated the thought. Simon Bolivar was like, thank you very much, America. We appreciate your Monroe Doctrine, okay? That's very, very good. Yeah, so we'll be involved making the Monroe Doctrine actually mean something in the years thereafter. It's going to get very, very interesting in Latin America. So that brings us to the end of our official notes. I've got some videos I want to show you and share with you as well here. And then I'll say a few more things to wrap this up. Okay? All right.
Guys, welcome to history. We got it going on for you today. Monroe Doctrine, a really simple explanation for all of you kiddies out there and adults who are taking tests and you need to know maybe an easy way to remember or to get the concept. The Monroe Doctrine was a doctrine issued by James Monroe in 1823, and I call it dog piss in the hood. And it's a really simple way to understand the idea. Of course, dog urination generally refers to the idea of warning somebody. And hood, of course, is kind of your neighborhood. So the concept here is that America is kind of outgrowing its Washington isolationism. we're not quite ready to go into the world and start pounding our fist on people's faces, but we certainly are at the point where we can turn to Europe and expand the isolationist doctrine with kind of a warning to Europe as well. So Latin America is the hood, dog piss is the warning, and the concept is an extension of isolationism. So it's half Washington. Europe, we will stay the hell away from you, war gods of evil. But, Europe, you need to stay away from our hood. So the Monroe Doctrine, although, like I've said previously, is not filled with enforcement, it is the beginning of the roots, really, of what will become imperialism. When we get to Roosevelt corollary, guys, we're going to put some teeth in that dog. We're going to have a baseball bat or Navy, and we're going to start kind of whacking heads. We're going to build the Panama Canal and do the Spanish-American War and grab, Hawaii and go out into the world and start to do things. But Monroe Doctrine, dog piss in the hood, 1823, James Monroe, Latin America, Europe, stay the hell away, and I'm done with you right now. You should go learn more things.
Yeah, that guy has got the whole video in the classroom thing figured out. Hip Hughes, yeah, that was really nice. All right, so the next one is actually from Disney, and it gives you some interesting Disney-fied history of James Monroe. So I'll share this with you as well. Here we go.
If the internet had been around in 1817, James Monroe would have been our most friended president. Even John Quincy Adams, who was considered a complete grouch, liked Monroe. So why was Monroe such a hot property? Well, it helped that ladies loved cool James.
Oh, James.
One Virginia socialite described him as tall and well-formed. In modern speak, that would be total hottie. Even Thomas Jefferson said that Monroe was so honest that if he turned his soul inside out, there would not be a spot on it. The extremely popular Monroe made it to the top of the A-list when he was elected the 5th president of the United States. Monroe had big plans for America, including making America bigger. His Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, convinced Spain to sell us Florida after we had already invaded it. Americans were spreading out, moving west, borrowing money, and buying land. Everyone was feeling so good about Monroe's presidency that they actually called it the era of good feelings. It was like a national beach party.
When Monroe was president, everybody was feeling really, really great. Maybe it was something in the water, I don't know. But people were fighting less and less. The political parties were getting along more and more.
But the party ended in 1819. Remember all that money people were borrowing to buy land? Many Americans couldn't pay back the money they borrowed. Everyone panicked. Banks failed. People lost their jobs and their homes. And those good feelings soon turned bad. Speaking of bad feelings, Monroe's second crisis dealt with the issue of slavery. When the territory of Missouri wanted to become the state of Missouri, the country was divided. Should Missouri be allowed into the Union as a slave state?
The Missouri Compromise was an attempt to balance slave and free states where there would be one for one. If a slave state came in, a free state would have to come into the Union.
Maine was added as a free state, keeping the number of slave and free states equal. But America was now pretty much literally divided in half. Monroe's most famous accomplishment is the Monroe Doctrine. It states that other countries can't come to the American continent and interfere in politics or colonize our lands.
I do not like when people who are not my close friends get all up in my business. All right? I certainly don't want overseas powers coming over to the Americas and getting up in our business.
Monroe actually didn't come up with the Monroe Doctrine. Again, his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, did. But Monroe put it in his second inaugural address, and, well, it's not called the John Quincy Adams Doctrine. That would have been a significantly less handsome doctrine. Monroe was so popular that no one ran against him during his second presidential election, and he served 2 terms. And his poor, underappreciated Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, was about to have a hard time following Monroe's act. His administration would be a lot less well-formed.
Yeah, so very interesting Disney-fied presentation on that. The stuff that they talked about with the Missouri Compromise and so forth, and slavery, we'll be getting into that in our third unit, the last unit for this semester. Okay, there is one final video I have to share with you. And of course, this is the video that kind of looks over all of the Spanish or Latin American wars of independence and so forth. Yes, it's John Green, Crash Course. So we'll play that one and then wrap this up.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today things are going to get a little bit confusing because we're going to talk about revolution and independence in Latin America. It's a bit confusing because 1, Latin America is big. 2, it's very diverse. 3, Napoleon makes everything complicated. And 4, as we've seen in the past, sometimes revolutions turn out not to be that revolutionary. Witness, for instance, the New England Revolution, who instead of trying to form new and better governments are always just kicking balls around like all the other soccer teams. Right, so before independence, Latin American society was characterized by 3 institutions that exercised control over the population. The first was the Spanish crown, or if you were Brazilian, the Portuguese crown. So as far as Spain was concerned, the job of the colonies was to produce revenue in the form of a 20% tax on everything that was called the royal fifth. So government administration was pervasive and relatively efficient because it had to be in order to collect its royal fifth. Then there was the Catholic Church. Even more than royal officials, the church exercised influence over people's everyday lives. I mean, the church even controlled time. The church bells tolled out the hours, and they mandated a 7-day work week so that people could go to church on Sunday. And finally, there was patriarchy. In Latin America, like much of the world, husbands had complete control over their wives, and any extra or premarital scoodly pooping was severely punished. I mean, when it was the women doing the illicit scoodly pooping, men could basically get up to whatever. This was mainly about property rights because illegitimate children could inherit their father's property, but it was constructed to be about, purity. To get a sense of how patriarchy shaped Latin American lives, take a gander at Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, whose name I'm actually abbreviating. A child prodigy who spoke 5 languages by the age of 16, de la Cruz wanted to disguise herself as a boy so she could attend university, but she was forbidden to do so. Still, she wrote plays and poetry, she studied math and natural science, and for being one of the leading minds of the 17th century, she was widely attacked and eventually forced to abandon her work and sell all 4,000 of her books. That's a shame because she had a great mind, once writing that Aristotle would have written more if he'd done any cooking. A couple other things. First, Latin America led the world in transculturation, or cultural blending. A new and distinct Latin American culture emerged mixing 1, whites from Spain called Peninsulares, 2, whites born in the Americas called Creoles, 3, Native Americans, and 4, African slaves. This blending of cultures may be most obvious when looking at Native American and African influences on Christianity. The version of Guadalupe, for instance, was still called Tenochtitlan, the indigenous earth goddess, by Indians, and the profusion of blood in Mexican iconography recalls the Aztec use of blood in ritual. The transculturation pervaded Latin American life, from food to secular music to fashion. Somewhat related, Latin America had a great deal of racial diversity and a rigid social hierarchy to match. There were 4 basic racial categories: white, black, mestizo, a mix of white and American Indian, and mulatto, a mix of white and black. We try not to use that word anymore because it's offensive, but that's the word they use. And from the 16th century on, Latin America had a huge diversity of mixed-race people, and there were constant attempts to classify them and divide them into castes. You can see some of these in so-called casta paintings, which attempted to establish in a very weird and enlightenment-y way all the possible racial combinations. But of course, that's not how race works, as evidenced by the fact that successful people of lower racial castes could become legally white by being granted gracias al sacar. So by 1800, on the eve of Latin America's independence movements, roughly a quarter of people were mixed race. All right, now let's have us some revolutions. How should we organize this, Stan? Let's begin with Latin America's most successful country as defined by quality of soccer team. So Brazil, he said as thousands of Argentines booed him, is obviously different because it was ruled not by Spain, but by Portugal. But like a lot of revolutions in Latin America, it was fairly conservative. The Creoles wanted to maintain their privilege while also achieving independence from the Peninsulares. And also, like a lot of Latin American revolutions, it featured Napoleon. Freaking Napoleon. You're everywhere. He's behind me, isn't he? So when Napoleon took over Portugal in 1807, the entire Portuguese royal family and their royal court decamped to Brazil. And it turned out they loved Brazil. King João loved Brazil so much. Off topic, but do you think that JWoww named herself after King João? I mean, does she have that kind of historical sensibility? I think she does. So King João's life in Rio was so good that even after Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, he just kind of stayed in Brazil. And then by 1820, the Portuguese in Portugal were like, hey, maybe you should come back and, like, you know, govern us, King of Portugal. So in 1821, he reluctantly returned to Lisbon, leaving his son, Prince Pedro, behind. Meanwhile, Brazilian Creoles were organizing themselves around the idea that they were culturally different from Portugal, and they eventually formed a Brazilian party. Stan, not that kind of party, come on. Yes, that kind. A Brazilian party to lobby for independence. Then in 1822, they convinced Prince Pedro of boring old Portugal that he should just become King Pedro of sexy big Brazil. So Pedro declared Brazil an independent constitutional monarchy with himself as king. As a result, Brazil achieved independence without much bloodshed and managed to hold on to that social hierarchy with the plantation owners on top. And that explains why Brazil was the last New World country to abolish slavery, not fully abandoning it until 1888. Right, so even when Napoleon wasn't forcing Portuguese royals into an awesome exile, he was still messing with Latin America. Let's go to a thought bubble. So Latin America's independence movements began not with Brazil, but in Mexico, when Napoleon put his brother on the Spanish throne in 1808. Napoleon wanted to institute the liberal principles of the French Revolution, which angered the ruling elite of the Peninsulares in what was then called New Spain. They were aristocrats, and they just wanted to go back to some good old-fashioned divine right monarchy with a strong church. So the Mexican Creoles, seeking to expand their own power at the expense of the Peninsular elite, saw an opportunity here. They affirmed their loyalty to the new king, who was French, even though he was the king of Spain. I told you this was complicated. Then a massive peasant uprising began, led by a renegade priest, Padre Hidalgo, and supported by the Creoles because it was aimed at the Peninsulares, even though they weren't actually the ones who supported Spain. This was further complicated by the fact that to the mestizo peasants led by Hidalgo, Creoles and Peninsulares looked and acted basically identical. They were both white and imperious, so the peasants often attacked the Creoles, who were technically on their side in trying to overthrow the ruling Peninsulares. Even though it had tens of thousands of supporters, this first peasant uprising petered out. But a second peasant revolt, led by another priest, Father Morelos, was much more revolutionary. In 1813, he declared independence, and the revolt lasted until his death in 1815. But since he was a mestizo, he didn't gain much Creole support, so revolutionary fervor in Mexico began to fade until 1820. When Spain, which was now under the rule of a Spanish rather than a French king, had a real liberal revolution with a new constitution that limited the power of the church. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So in the wake of Spain's liberalizing movements, the Mexican elites who had previously supported Spain switched sides and made common cause with the Creoles in the hopes that they could somehow hold on to their privileges. And pushing for independence together, things went very well. The Creole general Iturbide and the rebel mestizo commander Guerrero joined forces and won independence, with most of the Peninsulares returning to Spain. Iturbide, the whiter of the two generals, became king of Mexico in 1822. Remember, this was a revolution essentially against representative government. But that didn't work out, and within a year he was overthrown by the military and a republic was declared. Popular sovereignty was sort of victorious, but without much benefit to the peasants who actually made independence possible. This alliance between conservative landowning elites and the army, especially in the face of calls for land reform or economic justice, would happen over and over again in Latin America for the next century and a half. But before we come to any conclusions, let's discuss one last revolution. So Venezuela had a cadre of well-trained Creole revolutionaries who by 1811 had formed a revolutionary junta that seized power in Caracas and formed a republic. But the interior of Venezuela was home to mixed-race cowboys called llaneros who supported the king. They kept the Caracas revolutionaries from extending their power inland, and that is where Simón Bolívar, El Libertador, enters the picture. Bolívar realized that the only way to overcome the various class divisions, like the one between the Caracas Creoles and the Llaneros, was to appeal to a common sense of South Americanness. I mean, after all, the one thing that almost all South Americans had in common, they were born in South America, not Spain. So then, partly through shows of toughness that included like crossing flooded plains and going without sleep, Bolivar convinced the Llaneros to give up fighting for Spain and start fighting against them. He quickly captured the vice-regal capital at Bogota, and by 1822, his forces had taken Caracas and Quito. Hold on. Lest I be attacked by Argentines who are already upset about what I said about their really good soccer team, I want to make one thing clear. Argentina's General José de San Martin was also vital to the defeat of the Spanish. He led expeditions against the Spanish in Chile and also a really important one in Lima. And then in December of 1824, at the Battle of Ayacucho, the last Spanish viceroy was finally captured and all of Latin America was free from Spain. Oh, it's time for the open letter? That's a chair, Stan, but it's not the chair. An open letter to Simón Bolivar. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, Llanero. I wonder if his hips swivel when I wind him up. Context is everything. They do. Hey there, cowboy. Dear Simón Bolivar, first, you had fantastic mutton chops. It's as if you're some kind of handsome Martin Van Buren. You were a man of immense accomplishments, but those accomplishments have been richly rewarded. I mean, you have a country named after you, not to mention 2 different currencies. But for my purposes, the most important thing you ever did was die. You may not know this, Simón Bolivar, but when I am not a world history teacher sitting next to a fake fireplace, I am a novelist. And your last words, damn it, how will I ever get out of this labyrinth, feature prominently in my first novel, Looking for Alaska, except it turns out those weren't your last words. Your last words were probably, Jose, bring the luggage. And I decided to use your fancy, romantic, inaccurate last words. It's called artistic license. Put that in your luggage. Anyway, fantastic life. I just wish you'd nailed it a little bit better with your last words. Best wishes, John Green. So by 1825, almost the entire Western Hemisphere, with a few exceptions in the Caribbean, was free from European rule. Oh, right, and Canada. I'm just kidding, Canadians. It's so easy to make fun of you because you're so nice. And so I tease you, and then you're like, oh, thanks for noticing that we exist. My pleasure. Anyway, this is pretty remarkable, especially when you consider that most of this territory had been under Spanish or Portuguese control for almost 300 years. The most revolutionary thing about these independence movements were that they enshrined the idea of so-called popular sovereignty in the New World. Never again would Latin America be under the permanent control of a European power, and the relatively quick division of Latin America into individual states, despite Bolivar's pan-South American dream, showed how quickly the people in these regions developed a sense of themselves as nations distinct from Europe and from each other. This division into nation states prefigures what would happen to Europe in the mid-19th century, and in that sense, Latin America is the leader of 19th century world history. And Latin American history presages another key theme in modern life, multiculturalism. And all of that makes Latin America sound very modern, but in a number of ways, Latin American independence wasn't terribly revolutionary. First, while the Peninsulares were gone, the rigid social hierarchy with the wealthy Creoles at the top remained. Second, whereas revolutions in both France and America weakened the power of the established church, in Latin America, the Catholic Church remained very powerful in people's everyday lives. And then there is the patriarchy. Although there were many women who took up arms in the struggle for independence, including Juana Azurduy, who led a cavalry charge against Spanish forces in Bolivia, patriarchy remained strong in Latin America. Feminist ideas like those of Barry Wollstonecraft would have to wait. Women weren't allowed to vote in national elections in Mexico until 1953, and Peru didn't extend voting rights to women until 1955. Also, Latin America's revolutionary wars were long and bloody. 425,000 people died in Mexico's war for independence. And they didn't always lead to stability. Venezuela, for instance, experienced war for much of the 19th century, leading to as many as 1 million deaths. And it's important to note that fighting for freedom doesn't always lead to freedom. The past 2 centuries in Latin America have seen many military dictatorships that protect private property at the expense of egalitarian governance. Freedom, independence, and autonomy are complicated terms that mean different things to different people at different times. So too with the word revolutionary. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Location change because...
So there you have it. That is the completion of this unit on independence movements in the Americas. We're done. Make sure that you do the attendance question for today, because I'm going to be checking on that today. And yeah, miss you guys. It's not as much fun teaching to an empty classroom, and look forward to you guys being back in your seats here soon. So be safe, be healthy, and I'll be in touch. All right, bye. I hit pause. says it's still recording.